Masuma, it's a great honor to be here. Thank you so much. It's been many years since I spoke here last. And thank you so much for thinking of me and for inviting me. Well, I have a lot to cover, but let me just start off by saying that the buzzword we're all living with these days is connectivity. Somehow we're dreaming of a future which is being told to us that our energy problems will be solved because there will be gas from Iran, petroleum and gas from Turkmenistan through these pipelines, electricity from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. There will be roads and water, and the Chinese are going to invest 45 billion in building a Silk Route, which will link Pakistan to Central Asia and onwards. So the idea of connectivity is not new, in fact. The whole idea of the Silk Route, more than 1,000 years ago, was precisely connectivity. But the main issue of the Silk Route in those days was the connectivity could only continue as long as we kept the peace, as long as we were able to keep the region stable and secure. You can't have connectivity without stability and security. If the camel train is not able to cross the mountains because of bandits or because of any or the bad guys, then that connectivity is not there. That Silk Route can't be built. So the first thing I think that what we ought to be considering before we consider connectivity is how do we end the conflicts that Pakistan is engaged in particular. I'm thinking here about Karachi. Many people will say Karachi is probably being cleaned up. Balochistan, the civil war there has gone on for 11 years. It's out of the 5 civil war insurgencies in Balochistan, this is the longest running insurgency. But most of all has been the presence of the Afghan Taliban in Pakistan, which has itself created the Pakistani Taliban and led to all sorts of other extremist problems in Pakistan. So I'm really going to tackle this problem of how do we link connectivity with stability and security so that we can actually develop our foreign policy. The first point I want to make is that unfortunately, for the last, certainly since the 1970s and possibly earlier, we have used proxies, extremist groups, either Pakistani or foreign origin, to conduct partially our foreign policy. Now that includes using Afghan fundamentalists in the 1970s, well before the Soviet invasion brought the Americans into the picture and the funding of the so-called global jihad against the Soviet presence in Afghanistan. We were training people like Gulbuddin Hikmatyar and Ahmad Shah Massoud and Professor Rabbani in the early 1970s. So the idea, and of course then, if you look at every single war that has been fought by Pakistan, unfortunately many of these wars were triggered by proxies. The 1948 war in Kashmir was triggered by Pashtun fighters going in. 1965, Ayub Khan used he used soldiers disguised as guerrillas to go and try and create an uprising in Kashmir. Kargil was very similar to that. So the point is that we have felt Pakistan has felt interminably insecure, and the military, either when it was in power or without power, has usually depended on these proxies. I think the real mistake was to think that once we had acquired nuclear weapons, these proxies were still necessary. I don't think they were necessary. But in fact, after we acquired nuclear weapons, in the 90s, you see an intensification of the use of proxies. And this then becomes a very dangerous combination of nuclear weapons plus unpredictable proxies who can plunge your country into war at any time. I'm thinking recently of the Pathankot incident or the Mumbai attack 5 years ago, or even earlier the attack on the Indian Parliament and other such things. And the use of these proxies, unfortunately, has also very seriously affected our foreign policy. Today, I can tell you, because of the continued presence of Afghan Taliban in Pakistan, and so far the failure to halt or to bring about some kind of ceasefire in Afghanistan, and the breakdown of these talks, which are not all Pakistan's fault, and I'll go into that. Afghanistan has lodged a lot of failure on that front, and so have the Americans and other countries. But essentially, what we are looking at is that today all the countries, because we continue to host Afghan Taliban, all other major neighboring countries are doing much the same. Iran is funding Taliban in Western Afghanistan. It is arming and funding Taliban in Western Afghanistan in order to combat the influence of Pakistan within the Quetta-based and Peshawar-based Taliban. Russia is in touch with the Taliban in northern Afghanistan, and there is a great sense that Russia is probably arming and funding some of these Taliban in the north. The Central Asians are equally in touch, with the Taliban up in the north, largely because they're very scared of, since the fall of Kunduz, they're very scared of the Taliban entering their territory. And of course, there is the danger and the threat that Pakistan makes much of, which is the funding of the Taliban by India. So what I'm just trying to say, point out, is that when we follow a certain policy using proxies, that doesn't mean that you will have the advantage of that for the rest of your existence. All the neighboring states will do exactly the same. And the neighboring states often are richer, more powerful, and they're able to sustain their efforts longer than Pakistan. So let me just go back to where I think grievous mistakes have been made in our foreign policy. The first two, I think, chances we had to change this policy. The first was the end of the Cold War in 91, 92. When I think the idea of the two superpowers, India lined up on one side with Russia, Pakistan on the other with the United States, this whole thing came to an end. And in fact, what we saw in the region and globally was the building of trade organizations, trade pacts, the growth of the European Union, the growth of ASEAN, and here, unfortunately, in South Asia, very heavily due to India's rejection, we have no build-up of SAARC or any other regional organization. Pakistan in the early 90s decides that, having played a major role in getting rid of the Soviets from Afghanistan, we move a lot of these proxy resources to Kashmir and try and radicalize the Kashmir movement. From 91 to about 97, we saw the attempt to radicalize the Kashmir nationalist movement, which was anti-India but was a nationalist movement. They were looking for independence rather than for a jihad against India. But Pakistani groups went in there and turned a lot of these, turned a lot of young Kashmiris into fellow jihadis. But the result of that we're seeing today, in which the jihadi elements are much reduced, and the Kashmiri struggle, a nationalist struggle, a struggle for independence from India. Not that the emotion of the Kashmiris has faltered in any way, but the methods they're using are different from what we had imagined in the 90s. So I think the 90s, unfortunately, we support the Taliban in Afghanistan, just one of 3 countries in the world that do it. We isolate ourselves from the world by doing that, but we think that this is a very good bet because the Taliban will keep the Indians out of Afghanistan. So backing the Taliban is a good bet. Secondly, the second turning point I'd like to mention is 2001, 9/11, where really the whole world declares war against extremism and the use of these proxies. And for a time, we go along with the Americans. We support the American effort in Afghanistan, the military intervention that the Americans launched. But by 2003, General Musharraf decides to do a U-turn and revives and helps, encourages the Taliban to revive themselves. And by 2004, the Taliban are once again launching attacks in Afghanistan against the Americans and NATO and the newly formed Afghan army and forces. And so here's an instance where a proxy, having been defeated completely, and if you remember, I mean, I recall to you the picture in 2001, 2 and 3 in FATA and in the Northwest NWFP. In the North, there was literally the Taliban were a defeated element. There was no question of Pakistani Taliban emerging. There was a lot of depression and a lot of anxiety amongst the Pashtuns in the Northwest, and there was much talk of FATA reform and building and making FATA into bringing FATA into Pakistan as a proper part, legal part of it, rather than keeping it out as this kind of no man's land. Unfortunately, we did not take advantage of that. The army did not take advantage of that. It was a military rule at that time, and instead we revived the Afghan Taliban, thinking that, you know, by reviving the Afghan Taliban, we can shove them all into Afghanistan, we can shove some of our Pakistani dissidents also into Afghanistan, and we can keep the peace in Pakistan. Well, of course, you know, that was not to be the case. By 2005, 2006, you have the growth of the Pakistani Taliban. A hugely detrimental force which grew in strength and which then developed its own ideology, which was not just to defeat the Americans in Afghanistan, but was to actually overthrow the Pakistan state and to impose an Islamic state. So again, I think this opportunity of 9/11, and by then, you know, the whole world with Al-Qaeda and with the continuing terrorism, acts of terrorism in Europe, in the United States and in other places, Indonesia, Australia, the whole world puts Pakistan in the dock for continuing to support movements like the Taliban, etc. And if you remember, Musharraf denies that Osama bin Laden is even in Pakistan. And he said at one point he's escaped from Pakistan, at another point he said he's dead, he died. And of course, Osama bin Laden was discovered in Pakistan. So I think this opportunity, unfortunately, was also lost. Now we are facing now the last year or so a critical moment where we have pledged to try and bring peace to Afghanistan and try and persuade the Afghan Taliban to enter into a dialogue with Kabul. Now, unfortunately, I will go into the other side of this problem, which includes the Taliban, but first to deal with Pakistan. I think the real problem was that we somehow, and I do want to stress that the Afghan Taliban leadership is all living basically in Pakistan. The Quetta Shura is not named the Quetta Shura for nothing. It's named there because the leadership is sitting in Quetta and runs the Shura from there. There's a Shura in Peshawar also. And the real issue has been that the idea of trying to persuade the Afghan Taliban to enter into a dialogue with the Kabul government is not being backed for a long period of time, is not being backed with the due pressure that is needed. Pressure to persuade the Taliban to reduce the fighting in Afghanistan, to stop their supplies. Many of their supplies are crossing the border from Pakistan, not necessarily being given by the Pakistan government, but they have many sympathizers, and with their huge financial resources from the heroin trade, from kidnapping, from all these other sources, they're able to buy what they want. Remember, Afghanistan does really not produce anything of much value, and much of what they need, whether it's food, ammunition, clothes, boots, everything they need, has to come from somewhere. Some of it certainly is coming from Iran, some of it from Central Asia, but the bulk of it is still coming from Pakistan. And until you have a strategy which uses carrot and stick, the carrot being that, look, we are going to help you engage with talks with Kabul, get you global recognition, which will involve the Americans and the Chinese also eventually talking to you, and the stick, which is essentially cutting off supplies, putting pressure on the leadership that I'm sorry, but you can't live here forever. At some stage, you will have to leave Pakistan. Without those two elements, I think we have faced failure so far. And now, most recently, you may have read the Taliban have actually categorically refused to come to talks. Pakistan is still saying that this is posturing by the Taliban. One thing I've learned by spending a lot of time with the Taliban is that the Taliban don't posture. When they say something, they mean it. And what I fear now is the military situation in Afghanistan getting much worse. Now, that's one side of the problem. The other side of the problem is Afghanistan itself, where unfortunately Afghanistan has really been a big failure. There's no other way to describe it. The Americans have spent $1 trillion in Afghanistan. I think there was a huge a lack of strategy. The first mistake the Americans made was to desert Afghanistan for Iran in 2003, and leaving the warlords in charge of the peace and trying to bring stability to Afghanistan. It was a classic mistake which the Americans were to repeat 5 years later, or 8 years later, in Iraq actually, by leaving too early. They pulled out their troops, they pulled out between 2003 and about 2007, there was a presence of American forces no more than 20,000, most of them concentrated in the big city. So what we had was a lack of Western presence, and really a lack of any kind of proper plan for nation building and state building. And what I mean by state building is the building of infrastructure, of a human infrastructure, bureaucracy, judiciary, police, army, etc. And what I mean by nation building are many aspects of the economic and development side. None of these areas were really effectively carried out. And if you look, for example, today at Afghanistan, you've got schools that are lying empty because there are no teachers. You've got hospitals that are not being fully utilized because there are no doctors or no nurses. You have barely an economy. As I said, the Afghans do not really produce anything. You had a thriving agricultural economy in the 60s and 70s, which was exporting fruit and nuts and all sorts of agricultural produce all over South Asia. Not even that was restored in any comprehensive way. Unfortunately, when the Americans decided to leave, we discovered, of course, and people knew this, that most of the employment was being given by NATO and the Western forces. And the moment Western forces left in the last year or so, there has been mass unemployment amongst the newly educated Afghans who've now all left for Europe. And Afghans today constitute the second largest migrant population arriving in Europe after the Syrians. And many of them are middle class, educated Afghans, educated in the last 15 years, when the education had flourished for a time. And they had jobs also during this period. But then there's no economy. The second aspect of the crisis in Afghanistan has been political. The West has basically endorsed two rigged elections in Afghanistan. The first was the re-election of President Karzai, which was very heavily rigged, and the Americans and the UN chose to declare Karzai the winner, despite the pressure from the opposition, which was demanding a re-election or a recount, as it were. And that set the seeds for very deep divisions within the Afghan establishment. And by that I mean the ethnic groupings that had bedeviled Afghanistan in the past re-emerge now, because the opposition was largely constituted of non-Pashtun minorities. The Karzai himself represented the Pashtuns, who he claimed had won the election. And the deep ethnic divisions, which have been kind of surfaced over for the last few years after the departure of the Taliban the collapse of that regime, re-emerge. And that whole, those ethnic divisions were to emerge even stronger in the last elections, when unfortunately again, basically an election that was rigged on both sides, was validated by the Americans, who then put together this very artificial government which brought together Ashraf Ghani and the two candidates, Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah Abdullah. And that government, as we know, unfortunately has not been able to function effectively at all. We still don't have a full cabinet. We still don't have an attorney general or a man being able to capture a major province or even a city, and probably then being able to set up a rump interim government and declaring themselves the true government of Afghanistan. Now that has huge connotations for Pakistan, for the region, for the Afghan people, and for everyone else. It could mean the splitting of Afghanistan, the division of Afghanistan. So I'm extremely fearful that the military situation in the last 6 months has got much worse. We saw the Taliban capture Kunduz, the fourth largest city in the country in the north, and then being evicted from there. And right now we are seeing the Taliban more or less in control of Helmand province, the biggest drug-producing province in the country, where a lot of their income comes from and a lot of their support base comes from, which has and it borders Pakistan, so their supplies are constantly coming in. And the big fear is that apart from the capital, if they take the capital, Lashkar-Gah, we could well see an absolute crisis with this province. And I'm very fearful that if one province falls, there will be a domino effect. You'll get 2 or 3 provinces falling almost immediately on top of that. And clearly there will be panic in Kabul. There's already large-scale demoralization in the Afghan army, the Afghan police. They're inadequately trained. They don't have sufficient air power. There's a lot of corruption. Everything imaginable that you could imagine would go wrong has gone wrong with the building up of the Afghan army. And the American President Obama seems convinced that he can mend the gap by sending. At the moment, the Americans have got 9,000-10,000 troops there, and they've got some special forces, and some special forces are being used to bolster Afghan army divisions and brigades when they're confronting the Taliban and losing. But I don't see this as a strategy beyond the next 3 to 4 months. I think this will fail. And the moment you get the first American casualties with this strategy, I think you will get a demand from the American people to pull out their troops. Now, in the light of this, we are faced with the continuing presence of Pakistani Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, let me just explain. When General Raheel Sharif launched this operation in North Waziristan, and unfortunately it was done without any backup on the Afghan side. Now, if we had done this 2 years ago, the Americans and NATO had promised that while our troops are there, they will provide a backup for you so that you push these guys out into our arms and we will capture or kill them. What happened was just the opposite. We pushed them out, but there was nobody there to catch them. The Afghan army was too weak. The Afghan army had no control of the territory, the borderlands into which these Pakistani Taliban were given. So you had 1,000, perhaps 1,500 Pakistani Taliban retreating into some of the most inhospitable areas in Afghanistan, Kunar, Nuristan, and Nangarhar province. Now these provinces were never under the control of the Afghan government, even during the American presence. The Americans could deploy troops there, but invariably they could not secure the area. And Al-Qaeda has been living in these areas for since 9/11. So what you have was essentially the Pakistani Taliban moving into very inhospitable areas in which there was inadequate Afghan forces, no Western forces whatsoever, and they were able to reorganize themselves and once again launch attacks back into Pakistan. And this is what we see in the horrible attacks in Peshawar and Charsadda and other places. Now, The fallacy of this is that somehow, we have said that we are defeating or conquering the Pakistani Taliban. And, and the Afghan Taliban will be brought to the table. The point that is never really made is the following. These Afghan Taliban are living in Afghanistan. Who are they being hosted by? They're not living there on their own. They're being hosted by those people who control these territories. And that's not the Afghan government. That's the Afghan Taliban. So in fact, the Afghan Taliban are hosting enemies of Pakistan who are killing Pakistanis, coming back into Pakistan and killing Pakistan. And yet we are still allowing the Afghan Taliban to be hosted by Pakistan. Even though in Afghanistan they're doing exactly the opposite and hosting our enemies. So, this dichotomy has to be resolved. And we have been quite happily living with this dichotomy since 9/11. Or certainly since Musharraf relaunched the Taliban in 2003. And of course, in this area now, with the Pakistani Taliban there, the Al-Qaeda there, every other group under the sun has also assembled. The Uzbek movement, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, the Chechens, ISIS is there, and the Uyghurs. And I'll come to China. The Uyghurs are Chinese Muslims who have also been training and fighting in Pakistan, in the border regions, and mostly in Afghanistan. So this is the first dichotomy. The second issue is the weakness of a strategy in which we are really not willing to accept or portray the right message. I thought it was very brave of Sartaj Aziz Saab to have gone on the record a few days ago and declared that actually, yes, we've been hosting these Afghan Taliban all along. But I wish we would take that a bit further and say the Afghan Taliban in Afghanistan are also hosting the enemies of Pakistan. And we will not tolerate that any longer. Now, the other part of this equation is very much China. As you know, I'm not going to go into the Silk Route and all that. China has promised us a lot of money and a lot of facilities, and really China has emerged as a kind of second dispenser after the United States, which is probably retreating from this region. And given what the US was giving Pakistan billions of dollars in the 50s, the 60s, in the 70s, briefly with some breaks because of sanctions, because of our nuclear program, and certainly since 9/11 it's been giving something like $3 billion a year. 80% of that has gone to the military. Now China is promising something completely different. It is promising to build an infrastructure which will really help Pakistan develop its relations with the entire region and the world, and also make it a conduit, a bridge for energy supplies coming from Central Asia to India, from the Gulf right up to China and Central Asia. So we're looking at clearly a project of the century. But unfortunately, there are two or three weaknesses in this. The first, very much, is the presence of Uyghurs. Chinese Muslims have been using Pakistan as a militant base, not now. I met my first Uyghur militants at the Lashkar-e-Taiba office in Muridke in 1996. That's 11 years ago. And they were not here, to become mullahs or to become good Muslims. They were here to get trained. Now and we didn't stop it, unfortunately. When it was just a trickle, we didn't stop it. But it has seriously now affected relations between China and Pakistan. Because these Uyghurs have gone on to fight in Afghanistan. Many of them are now in Syria. They have their own Uyghur brigade in Syria. They are fighting, taking part in the civil war there, along with other, multinational groups. And they're becoming, in a sense, a small element of them are becoming global jihadists, which must be very worrying for China. and must be very worrying for also the idea of the Silk Route. Are we going to build a new infrastructure for this region when this region is still sending in militancy, etc.? Now, the other aspect of this I'm not going to go into is China's policies towards the Uyghurs, which are also very questionable and which would need a whole debate about it themselves. But I think China is pursuing far too repressive policies against the Uyghurs, which is punishing the population rather than punishing the militants. But anyway, that's another thing. But clearly now Pakistan has promised that we will raise a whole brigade of 10,000 men who will protect the Chinese engineers who will be coming to build these roads and Gwadar and all the rest. Now I ask you, I mean, would you prefer a peace settlement in Balochistan and a peace settlement and peace in the region, or do you think 10,000 troops are going to protect a couple of thousand of Chinese engineers? And tragically, we have seen in the past that Chinese engineers, etc., have been killed, have been kidnapped by the Taliban, by the Baloch, by all sorts of people. So, in my opinion, security is not established by making more and more military forces. We have rangers, and then we have extra rangers, and then we have extra rangers, and then we have special forces, and then we have special forces for the rangers. How many armed militia groups are we going to make in this country? But what is needed are political solutions to what are essentially political problems. So, a really massive rethink. At the moment, so much money is going towards setting up armed groups that I think it's very detrimental to the country. So let me just say that I think with where we are at the moment is in a very tight corner, and we need a lot of rethinking in order to get out of this and in order to really promote peace in Afghanistan, which in turn hopefully will promote peace in Pakistan itself. Thank you very much.